Welcome. About 5 years ago, a group of former law clerks to Jon O. Newman of the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit presented their mentor with a very special gift. To honor his 35 years of service on the bench, they endowed a fund, and I'm quoting now from the endowment, to support an annual lecture in global justice or public international human rights or comparative law by a distinguished individual who is not a citizen of and does not reside in the United States. So let me just say that this simple fact eloquently testifies to how adored Judge Newman is by those who know him best. And that same depth of admiration extends to all who know or have, in fact, any dealings with Judge Newman. So in previous years, we have had the good fortune to host Newman lecturers like the president of the International Criminal Court and the former United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights. And today, we have the really extraordinary privilege to welcome a world leader who can rightly be called, I think, one of the most significant statesmen of our era, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair. As most of you know, Tony Blair served as Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007. He was the youngest British Prime Minister since 1812. In the 100-year history of the British Labour Party, it had never, ever won 2 successive terms, but under Tony Blair, it won 3. Our 2 most recent presidents, Bill Clinton and George Bush, do not agree on very much, but they do agree in their deep admiration for Tony Blair. Even though he is no longer in office, Tony Blair remains a formidable presence on the world stage. He is the official envoy of the Quartet, the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations to the Palestinian territories. And his tireless efforts to promote peace in the Middle East have included 73 trips since he left office. And in addition, you should know that Mr. Blair is the leader of major international foundations devoted to improving governance on the African continent, to reducing climate change, and to increasing access to sports for disadvantaged young people. And I should also add that he is both a Yale professor and a Yale parent. Last year, Mr. Blair added a new role to his remarkable repertoire, that of a best-selling author. His memoir, A Journey, chronicles his leadership, his life in politics and in leadership, and it has been very favorably reviewed. And that book continues, I want to say, a very great British tradition. It was one of Mr. Blair's predecessors, Winston Churchill, who said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." It is remarkable, really, how much history was packed into Tony Blair's years at 10 Downing Street. In 1 decade, he carried out major reforms to education, to health care, to minimum wage. He brokered the Good Friday Peace Agreement in Northern Ireland. He oversaw military operations in Sierra Leone, in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He managed the response to the July 7th, 2005 terrorist attack on the London subway, and he personally led the successful bid to bring the Olympic Games to London. But perhaps less appreciated in the United States at large, but very important here at the Yale Law School, Mr. Blair, who is himself a barrister, also spearheaded the most sweeping transformation of the British constitutional system in the past century. Alfred Lloyd Tennyson once described Great Britain as, I'm quoting him now, a land of settled government where freedom slowly broadens down from precedent to precedent. Well, during Prime Minister Blair's tenure, that settled government suddenly and quite unexpectedly took a quantum leap. Tony Blair was responsible for reforms that radically transformed the House of Lords, that created Britain's first Supreme Court, that modified the office of Lord Chief Chancellor, that established major human rights legislation, that fundamentally altered the relationship between British judges and British legislation, and that brought about devolution for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and London. An eminent British legal scholar once called the slate of reforms a quiet constitutional revolution. And to me, that revolution really reveals what is the defining quality of Tony Blair's leadership. He is a master at finding common ground, of devising new procedures to solve seemingly intractable problems, of bringing people together despite their bitter differences. He managed, this is a remarkable achievement, he managed to unify divergent factions within the Labour Party. He fostered reconciliation between the hostile parties in Northern Ireland. And he preserved British sovereignty while nevertheless participating in the multinational institutions of Europe. Christopher Hitchens has once very shrewdly, I think, observed that one of Tony Blair's great strengths has been his strong belief that Britain has both an Atlantic and a European future. And that may sound obvious as a point, Hitchens writes, except, and I'm quoting him now, for the fact that most British prime ministers after World War II believed that Britain was anchored in one or another allegiance. Tony Blair alone, and I think because he so straightforwardly appreciates the messy and the obstinate complexity of human facts, has managed to negotiate the divide between the United States and Europe. Tony Blair's achievements are widely recognized. He is one of very, very few individuals who has been awarded both the Congressional Gold Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which are the two highest civilian honors that the United States government can give. Last year, he also received the Liberty Medal from the National Constitution Center, and that's an honor whose past recipients include the likes of Nelson Mandela and Thurgood Marshall. In his work since leaving office, Mr. Blair has increasingly focused on the question of religion. One of the most striking and indeed most noticed lines in his memoir was his declaration, and I'm quoting now, "I have always been more interested in religion than in politics." And in a speech last month, Mr. Blair said, "On every side, in every quarter, wherever we look and analyze, religion is a powerful, motivating, determining force shaping the world around us." And at present, Mr. Blair is exploring this very crucial issue through the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, which includes, among other things, his course in Faith and Globalization, which he teaches at Yale University. So today, for the Newman Lecture, we're going to have the great privilege of a conversation with Tony Blair, and we will talk about two subjects, the subject of religion and the subject of constitutional reform in Great Britain. But before we begin that conversation, please join me in extending the warmest possible welcome to Tony Blair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Post, and everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today at Yale. It's an honor to be part of the Newman Lectures. Thank you so much indeed for extending the invitation to me and to the judge and all his family. Thank you for being here. And thank you also for having the imagination to create a series such as this, where people can come and talk more broadly about some of the crucial issues of the day. I mean, I have to make one confession, first of all, which Dean is the Dean of the Law School, and I was obviously at the Law School of Oxford, in fact. I wasn't a very distinguished student, has to be said. One of my more embarrassing occasions in my life was after about 6 months at Oxford, meeting someone in the quadrangle of St. John's College, where I was a student. The guy looked kind of vaguely familiar to me. And he asked me where the law library was situated. I said, I really don't know. So he said, well, let me show you, since I'm your law tutor, and we've not yet had the pleasure of your acquaintance. But law was very much part of my life, because my wife is a lawyer, and actually is a very distinguished lawyer. And so we met at bar school, indeed, where she came top of the bar exams for the country, and I had to search quite a long way down the list to find my name. So I'm giving all the wrong messages to your students. By the way, it's important to work really hard. Okay. And then I actually did practice for 7 years as a lawyer, which I enjoyed immensely, and I learned an awful lot, including a very important lesson in life, actually, which is when you've appeared in front of certain members of the judiciary, and you have been subject to the ritual humiliation that I was subjected to, it's a great preparation for the House of Commons later in life. I always remember appearing when I was just out of my pupillage as a lawyer in front of the Court of Appeal, in front of a very irascible old judge, and I hadn't really a very good case, truth be told, which is probably why they'd given it to me to do at a very young age in the Court of Appeal. And I always remember, it's just one of these uncomfortable situations, the sweat began to kind of just stumbling on. And he finally said to me, "Mr. Blair, that's the 6th time you've made that point. And let me inform you of something. It wasn't a very good point to begin with." So anyway, later in life, all those lessons stood me in good stead. Now, just to set the scene for the conversation that I will have with the Dean, I think the big distinction in politics today that I see is rather different from the distinction I was brought up with in the Labour Party in the 1970s. And these left-right distinctions dominate our politics still very much today. I think in a curious way, though, I find an odd thing happening in politics, which is the political parties become more partisan as the public, in fact, congregates more easily on the center ground where they have a less ideological view. And it's a fascinating thing because one of the things that I'm able to do in my new life is I travel and see the world. In fact, I always think one of the things that really struck me since leaving office is how much I didn't know when I was there, which is a slightly embarrassing admission to make. But you learn about the world, and you see how the world's developing, and different countries are finding their way to the future. And the big distinction today, I think, in politics is between what I would call the open-minded view of the world and the closed-minded. In other words, I think there are some people who look at the way that globalization is developing and pushing the world together, and they feel that is a threat. It's a danger to them. It makes them feel uncomfortable. It insists that they live with diversity and difference in circumstances where they don't feel that they want to be in that world. The difference between those and people with a sort of closed mind and those people who see globalization essentially as an opportunity, that the world opens up, who see diversity as enriching our society, who look at the world and say, well, look, there's great opportunities as it comes together, online, through the internet, physically, through migration, and through mass communication. And you see this open-minded versus closed-minded distinction in culture. One of the reasons why I think it's so important to develop and analyze this idea of religion and its place in the modern world is the world is still very religious, in some parts of the world becoming more so, and yet how religion interacts with democracy in the society is an immensely important issue, indeed challenge. And whether you end up with an open-minded view towards people of different faiths and cultures or a closed-minded view will in many ways, I think, determine whether the 21st century is peaceful or not. I think it unlikely that the 21st century will see fundamental conflicts of political ideology. I may be wrong, but I think it's unlikely. I think that belongs to the 20th century. I think it is perfectly possible that we end up with fundamental conflicts of religious or cultural ideology. So understanding culture and religion and faith is vitally important. I see this particularly when I'm out in the Middle East at the moment, and no one can understand what's happening in the Middle East unless they understand the importance of religion to the people out there. The Dean was kind enough to reference the fact to my 74 visits to Israel and Palestine since leaving office. Although I came back from my last visit and said to my wife that this would be my 74th visit, and I was quite proud of that commitment. And she said to me, yeah, but it's not the number of visits, it's where's the peace, which I thought was not really very comradely, but anyway, that was, but she's kind of right, I'm afraid, about it. But the revolution that's going on in that part of the world, how people then emerge from those with an attitude that is open-minded or not will depend radically on how those countries develop and how they affect the region about them. I think you can see this in respect of the economy. The open-minded approach is the only approach that's going to create successful economies today. The whole purpose of education should be to educate people with a broad view of life, with an open view of life. And if economies succeed today, it's because of the development of human capital. The closed mind can't do that, only the open mind can. One of the reasons why I find debates about immigration very depressing sometimes, on my side of the water, even occasionally on your side of the water, is that actually our societies will succeed in part by the energy and vitality and creativity of people who come from the outside. And to end up with a closed mind towards that is, I think, unfortunate and probably economically regressive for us. And then there's a third aspect of the open mind, which is being open to change and innovation. And again, one of the things I notice in every part of the world today is that those countries and those societies that succeed have this openness, not just to other people, and not just to the possibilities economically of globalization. They have an openness to the concept that in a world whose chief characteristic is the speed of change, that they themselves are prepared to change and adapt their thinking. And when I became Prime Minister in the UK, it's true I had made a lot of changes in the Labour Party in order to win power, but I also thought of myself very much as a modernizer, both for my party and for my country. And the reason for that was because I could see the world changing so fast, and I knew of my own country, not just its constitution, but its public services, its welfare system, the way it thought about the world. If that didn't change equally fast, we were going to get left behind. So I think that's where I would, in a way, start the conversation. I think this is a world of enormous possibility and opportunity, but it will belong to the open-minded. And it's only if we can create the circumstances through education, through interaction, through learning to live with each other and learn from each other, that we're going to be able to create a 21st century of peaceful coexistence and enhanced prosperity with the spread of justice and opportunity for people that do not have it, if we ensure that that open concept to the world is the one that is dominant. And I think that's an enormous challenge, and there's no better place to talk about it than at this university, such a great and distinguished institution of learning. So thank you very much for having me here. It's a great privilege to be here, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, with which I couldn't agree more. So maybe that's a place to begin our conversation. On the open mind. And it's been said of you in England that you are the Prime Minister who was most driven by religious faith since Gladstone. And often religion has two sides, and typically in this country one can associate religious faith not with the open mind, but with the closed mind, faith as distinguished from Enlightenment reason. And it's the place of religion in a democracy is often figured as religion shutting down and faith shutting down, reason opening up. But you plainly have a different idea of what faith is and how religion connects. And I'm going to invite you to say a few words about that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, people would always ask me about the part faith played in my life as a Prime Minister. And I always say to people, look, the thing about your religious faith is it informs your life and your character, obviously, in a way. But the kind of disappointing and irritating thing is, you can't go off into a corner and pray and say, God, what should the minimum wage be next year? Because he doesn't tell you, unfortunately. You're on your own on that one. So it can't. Faith shouldn't be used in a very instrumental way for policy, in my view. But I think that where faith does matter enormously is that it really, when I analyze the world of faith today, I see two separate characterizations of it. One is faith which is about the service of others. Right? It's and this is a value common to nearly all the main faiths. This concept of doing to others as you would have them do unto you, loving your neighbor as yourself, that very powerful compulsion to do good in the service of others. What I would say is faith as profound human compassion. And then you have faith effectively as the badge of identity, where you don't really accept there should be others. Okay. This is my faith. If you do not share it, you are an outcast, an infidel, an unbeliever, or someone who is not worthy in some way. Now, up to now, very much my type of people, if you like, which are pretty liberal-minded people, have tended to think, look, the way of dealing with this is just to get rid of it, the faith bit. If only the world didn't have religion, we wouldn't have all these problems. I don't think you will get rid of faith. So the question really is, how do you ensure that what I think is hugely liberating and reasonable view of faith, based on this concept of compassion and justice and help for others, how does that predominate over a narrow doctrinal ideological view of faith that ends up causing difference and conflict? And I think that's the challenge. And so in a way, we've got to get above this notion that somehow the best way of dealing with this is to pretend it doesn't exist, because that won't work.
So in your experiences in working through faith-based conflicts, like in Northern Ireland or in the Middle East, where I take it an identitarian set of beliefs were in struggle with each other, how did you manage to flip that and use faith in the other way?
Well, one way of doing it was not to try to insist that faith had nothing to do with it. I always used to say this about Northern Ireland. People would say to me, it's not really about religion, and I'd say, well, that's a pity, because the people engaged in it think it is. So you've got a bit of a problem dealing with this thing here. And when I look at, when I'm out in Israel and Palestine all this time, I can't see a resolution of the issue of Jerusalem, which is probably the most difficult issue, without some concept of cultural coexistence. Otherwise, how do you do it? So there is a limit to politics of this. And, one of the things I think is fascinating about this is when I started my foundation about religious interfaith, and I would say to people outside of politics, this is what I was doing, they would think it very odd. What on earth are you doing starting a foundation about religious faith? When I would mention it to political leaders, they would get it immediately. Because if you're in politics, you're seeing the way the world is developing and the impact of religion on it. And out in the Middle East, obviously, it's absolutely crucial. So the way I tried to bring people together was not to say, look, leave your religion out of it and then let's all work it out. Because it was to say, okay, bring your religion to the table and let's talk about how we make sense of that in the context of living together.
Was it helpful in those conversations that you were yourself a person of faith, or was that, strictly speaking, irrelevant?
It was always relevant, although, sometimes, obviously, with the Protestants, it was difficult with not, it was not the referendum Paisley. So it was not always easy. But on the other hand, I think one thing I've learned today is that, strangely, if you are a person of faith, you have a connection at a certain level with someone else who's a faith, even if they're a Buddhist, never mind a Protestant versus Catholic. So yeah, on the whole, actually, strangely, it did help.
So in American Middle East policy now, one can see an extreme queasiness about religion. We have Arab Spring, which is this wonderful movement in which a population is throwing off dictatorships, and religion is plainly an important force in it. And at the same time, one sees in American foreign policy, at least, a fear that it's going to turn into an Iran, that a dark side of religion is going to emerge. And I sense, at least myself, an uncertainty about how to deal with the religious forces which the Arab Spring is unleashing.
Yeah, absolutely. There is an uncertainty about it. So how do we deal with this? I mean, first of all, what's going on in the Middle East is a revolution, right? It's going to carry on. And the thing about revolutions is never where they begin, but where they end. Right? So what you've basically got out in the Middle East are three elements. You see this all over the place. You've got regimes that have an oppressive grip on power, but who provide a certain stability, and by the way, sometimes provide a certain guarantee of religious freedom, okay, which is why this thing gets a little more complicated, and why sometimes it's not quite accurate to look at this like the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's a little more complicated than that. So you've got that first element, which are regimes in power for a long time. Sometimes they're corrupt and so on and so forth, oppressive, but nonetheless, they provide the order. The second element are what I call the kind of liberal Google type people. You know, the people who basically are on the internet, they're basically open-minded. And then the third element are the Islamists who are obviously based on the concept, their politics is based on the concept that Islam is the answer. And the trouble is, the second and the third element are in absolute agreement in getting rid of the first, right? But what they're not in agreement about is what then happens. Okay. And there's another point that is very different, which is the second element, that's the liberal Google types, are very well-meaning, but disorganized. Okay, the third element's highly organized, right? So the issue there is, we've got a Robert. No, I think that's for you. I don't. Do you? By the way, Robert, do you sing? Is this a? This is not.
I was in a rock band.
No, I actually was in a rock band, but there you are. But please no, that would be a bad idea. So you've got these three elements, and the interesting thing to my mind is this, you see. You're right, we obviously are. We look at the Muslim Brotherhood and we think, well, this, how do we make sense of this? How do we understand it? And my point is, first of all, you've got to engage with it. You can't pretend it's not there, I'm afraid. That's just the truth of it. It is there. But the other point is, you've got to engage with this as a matter of religion and not just as politics.
How do you do that?
You do that by you do that by having a conversation. This is why I started my foundation about interfaith, that is not just about politics, economic policy, and so on, but very specifically about, look, if you've got a country like Egypt, you've got 10 million Copts there, Christian Copts. You're not just got Muslims. So how do we coexist together peacefully? And how do you ensure that those people within the religion of Islam, but by the way, you can make similar points about Judaism, Christianity, and so on, how do you make sure that those people who believe in that peaceful coexistence are able to justify that concept religiously and scripturally and not just politically? You see, because the danger is otherwise what you say to people out in that region is, okay, it's a choice. You've got your religion or you've got, the modern world. But by the way, you can't have both because they're in fundamental opposition to one another. Now, a lot of people, I'm afraid, do believe they are in fundamental opposition to one another, but if you present people with that choice, it's never going to work. Whereas if you say, actually, if you study the Quran and you engage with the context of the 7th century, and now we're in the 21st century, you can make sense of a modern view and a modernizing view and a peaceful coexistent view of Islam. And many, many people engage with it and embrace it. But you're going to have to make that argument. And the danger for us in a way in the West is that we don't quite know how to engage with this phenomenon.
Well, is this working now? Can you hear me? So if I could just add, how do you as a Catholic say to a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, here's a better interpretation of the Quran?
You can't. Exactly, you can't. But what you can do is, and this is the importance of interfaith, is create a situation in which Muslims recognize that Christians also are having this debate, right? That's the importance of interfaith. It's a really interesting thing where I had a discussion with one major Muslim leader out in the Middle East who also assists in the process of interfaith. And I said to him, why are you so interested in this interfaith concept? And he says, because it's absolutely essential that in my religion, where the case is that you people disrespect us, that we create a platform which is obvious you're prepared to engage with us. And the people doing the disrespecting are those who refuse to engage. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is you see, we've got to think of new ways and new methods of dealing with all this. And look, I went through military conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, so I'm well aware both of the limitations of military action and the difficulties of it. But in the end, the answer to this is to engage at an intellectual level that includes the religious dimension. That's my point. It cannot simply focus on the politics, otherwise it won't work.
So in the West now. Now.
Please.
I'm going to shout. So when we're talking within, say, Western Europe, we have an issue of how to regard religion, on the one hand, as a matter of faith, and on the other hand, as a culture, as an ethnos. And at least in this country, in the early 20th century, we gave the term cultural pluralism to allowing many different faiths to exist and to flourish in their distinctiveness. And often that's called now multiculturalism in Europe. Mm-hmm. But David Cameron has said famously that in Britain, state multiculturalism has failed. And this is what he said. He said, "We have failed to provide a vision of society to young Muslims to which they feel they want to belong. We have even tolerated segregated communities behaving in ways that run counter to our values. And all this leaves some young Muslims feeling rootless, and the search for something to belong to and believe in can lead them to extremist ideologies." So I read that as moving more toward an assimilationist model, what we would call in the United States in the early days a melting pot model. One sees a similar tendency in France with the rules against the burqa and against the veil. How would you advise us to handle this problem of religion as a cultural diversity issue?
Well, I'm not sure you shouldn't be advising us, really, but it's, look, I came to this view of it, dealing with it in a very practical way as Prime Minister. I think that, first of all, democracy is, in my view, not just about a constitutional system of government. It's also about an attitude of mind. And I think the single most important thing I tried to say to people out in the Middle East region is do not think democracy is just about voting in the government. Democracy is also not just the freedom to vote, it's freedom of expression, it's a free media, it's freedom of religion, it is a whole attitude, right? And where I think our societies should strike the right balance is that you say, we are pluralistic and we allow diverse faiths, and it's great that this diversity exists, and you know, you can be a Muslim, I'm a Christian, you're a Jew, and so on, and that there is a space in which we pursue our own faith in our own way, and that is our entitlement and our freedom. But there is then another space which we hold collectively in common. And in that space, there are certain values that society stipulates that we share, and that part of being a member of the society is that you are agreed that those values are those that you share. So you cannot justify discrimination against women on the basis of religion. You know, you cannot say, well, I don't like what the government's doing, so I think terrorism is a legitimate way of expressing my displeasure. This common space and these common values what we share in common and what define us collectively as a society. Now, I think sometimes you actually have a closer concept of that in the US than we do sometimes in Europe, and particularly with your Constitution and the First Amendment and so on, which you're an expert. So that's how I think you strike the right balance. And the thing about multiculturalism is, I actually think we've got to be very careful of this, because although this is quite a difficult thing to say, I think nonetheless it is true, and in a way the quote that you gave from David Cameron's speech indicates it, that people say to me multiculturalism's failed. I say, well, hang on a minute here. What's the problem with a Hindu community in the UK? Or the Jewish community, or the Chinese community, right? Actually, with a large part of the Muslim community, there's no problem, right? So actually what you're talking about is something specific. So you've got to be quite careful, I think, because in a way you don't want to say, well, it's a very specific problem, because then people feel stigmatized, but the truth is, it is a specific problem. Now, it's not specific to all Muslims. That would be grossly unfair and wrong. And the majority of Muslims actually want to live peacefully with everyone else, but it is a problem in certain parts of the Muslim community, and that's where your common space matters. That's where, for example, when I was Prime Minister, it was very controversial to do this. I was saying to people, you've got to learn to speak English. You can't have communities where second-generation people are just within their own community not speaking our common language. And that's part of the common space that we share together. So that's the way I think we deal with it, but it's an issue everywhere. And it's as the world opens up to more and more democracy, which is, in my view, an inevitable trend of history, it becomes more and more important to define that.
The common space.
Yeah.
So in the United States, when we think about religion and the common space, we have two values that we put on the table. We talk about free exercise, the ability to exercise, and we talk about no established religion. And plainly in Great Britain, you have a different balance. You have, your monarch is the head of the Anglican Church. Your parliament will set the rules of prayer in Anglican churches and the forms of worship. You have in the House of Lords 2 archbishops and 24 bishops who sit and make rules. So how do you think that balance can survive in this world that you've described?
I think it survives because, let me choose my words carefully, but it's actually more important historically than it is practically. Okay. Let me choose my words carefully on that. I'll get in trouble, not least with the Queen, which would be bad. Tower of London still exists. I think, therefore, if it started to make a real impact on people's lives, they get worried about it. It's now, formally, there are people appointed, through the Queen as the head of the church and so on, but in practical terms, it doesn't impinge greatly on people's daily lives. We do have the situation where in the House of Lords, you've got religious leaders. But that's kind of also an interesting aspect about what the House of Lords is for, in a way. So it's not, although again, historically, the reason was because of the established church. Actually, we have the chief rabbis join the House of Lords and so on. So yeah.
Well, that's a good pivot to the question of constitutional reform in the House of Lords. So I think in 1999, you led through the Parliament the House of Lords Act that stripped it of all but 92 of its hereditary peers. And in your platform at the time, you said that was the first stage in a process of reforms to make the House of Lords more democratic and representative. And then, of course, you took the law lords out of the House of Lords and you put them in their own separate Supreme Court. These are radical changes in the House of Lords. And it does lead me to ask you, well, as you just said, what is the House of Lords for? And what should it be its role in British democracy? Or is it sort of like the Queen being the head of the church? Or how would you imagine it?
Well, it matters in one sense a lot more because, of course, to get any legislation through in UK, you've got to go through both houses of Parliament, except for the budget, by the way. But you've got to go through both houses of Parliament. And when I came to power, I mean, the hereditary peers really were a pretty grotesque hangover from the past. I mean, I used to have these people used to sort of talk to me in terms of absolute outrage about altering it. And I said, but why should, I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, Charles II is a mistress, you know, the kid ends up as Duke of somewhere or other, and he's now making laws in 1999. It strikes me as a little unfair. Plus what struck me as particularly unfair as the Labour leader is that it meant that there was always an inbuilt Tory majority through the aristocrats in the House of Lords. So basically, we could get outvoted at any point in time by them. So this was the minimum change. The interesting question about the House of Lords, though, is what is it for? Because at the moment, basically, you've got a House of Lords dominated by appointed peers. And it's a very interesting debate because now the Conservative Party in the UK, having been very hostile to all this constitutional change, is now an advocate of a fully elected House of Lords. They decided, you know, you can't beat them, join them, and they got right on side with the whole thing. And curiously, I mean, I don't believe we should bring the hereditaries back, by the way, but the interesting thing is, though, I think for us in the UK, if you think of the House of Lords as a genuine revising chamber, I'm not sure it's sensible just to replicate an elected system in the House of Lords that we have in the Commons. And I kind of think that what you end up with is everyone who couldn't get in the Commons, you kind of put them on lists and they get into Lords elected on proportional representation and so on.
So what should it be?
It should be, I think, a genuine revising chamber where you're drawing expertise in from people who haven't spent a lifetime in politics. And one of my big things about politics today is that I think there's a real problem with the gene pool that we're entering into the political sphere, because I don't know what it's like with you, but with us now, very often you'll get kids who go to university, might go to a great school like this or its equivalent in the UK. They then become a researcher to an MP. They then after a time become an MP, and then they're a minister and blah, blah, right. They've never done anything other than politics. Now, I go back to my 7 years in law, which was immensely useful for me. I mean, it taught me an enormous amount. It was very formative, actually. It's not something I often talk about, but it was very formative. I dealt with people who weren't interested in politics. And the trouble with politics is you become obsessive about it. You think everyone's interested in politics. Most people don't care about politics most of their time, right? You know, they will switch on at certain points, but they don't spend their lives, as we in the political world do, thinking about politics all day. And what happens is you don't get people with the right experience of business, you don't get the right experience of, you know, general society, they haven't worked outside of politics, they get in this closed world. So I think the House of Lords, in a funny way, has got a modern function, which you're better off not just replicating your elected system, but the elected system should have, in the end, you know, the dominant say, but as a revising chamber, to have people who've got outside experience could be, I think, good and helpful. And sometimes, you know, the debates in the House of Lords are often of a higher quality. I mean, I have to be quite honest about it, than the debates in the House of Commons, because sometimes, you know, you have a debate, say, about healthcare. You get one of the leading surgeons in the country standing up and giving a view about how this might impact. It's in many ways more interesting. I ended up with some of my finest ministers were people that I appointed to the House of Lords, because they were maybe in their 40s by then. It was too late for them really to go and get a seat and do all the politicking. And frankly, some of them weren't very good at politics. You know, they lapse into outbursts of honesty and frankness that was a complete anathema when they got into the political scene, you know. And so every so often you try to get one of them in the Commons and, you know, it wouldn't work at all. They just say exactly what they thought. And so, you know, but these people gave us a breadth and an extra dimension. So that's what I think the House of Lords is there for today, and why I've strangely moved against this concept of a wholly elected House.
So I hear in that answer some distrust of a wholly popular form of government. And this goes, of course, to a great difference between the UK and the United States, because in our country we view the sovereignty as lodging in the people, who then elect their Congress and their president, but it's always the people who are the ultimate source of political authority. And in the UK, it's been a very different form of sovereignty. It was the monarch in Parliament. The Westminster system does not regard the population, let's put it that way, as the ultimate sovereign, but the monarch in the Parliament. And yet, when you were prime minister and you wanted to have the structural change of what we would in this country call a form of federalism, a decentralization, devolution to Scotland and to Wales and to North Ireland, you did that via a mechanism which is very unusual in the UK, a referendum, which seems to appeal from the Parliament to the people, which is a very American kind of move, not a very traditional UK kind of move, although you did have the EC referendum to go on as a president. But how did you feel, and why were you making, does that mean that the Westminster system, parliamentary sovereignty, is kind of eroding in your mind, or?
No, I think there's a case for using a referendum where you're embarking on a constitutional change of some nature. So with devolution, we did it partly because, by the way, partly because of the House of Lords. I mean, people for 100 years have been trying to get devolution in the UK, which means that effectively Scotland has its own parliament, Wales its assembly, and the reason why we ended up with the split in Ireland was that between North and South really was because devolution failed. Gladstone tried to get devolution through, and when you study it, the problem is usually the House of Lords, because they would always block it. So actually my reasoning for a referendum was partly because it was a major constitutional measure, but I also thought if we had a referendum and the people said, we're in favor of devolution, which they did, then it was going to be harder for the House of Lords to block it, which it was. And that was the reason we got it through in the end, because in the end they didn't block it. They argued about its detail, but they didn't block the essential principle.
But in doing that, you're appealing to the people as a form of political authority, not in a formal sense, but in a practical presidential sense, right?
Yeah, and I think, for Britain, for example, in Europe, as you rightly say, we had a referendum there too, because there was, significant transfer of powers. We're going from the British system to Europe. Now, I think you've got to treat referendums with a lot of care. I mean, they're a bit like you have propositions that you put in
California.
Yeah. That's California. But you've got to treat this with a lot of caution, I think. But it's in certain aspects, in certain cases, I think it's justified. And we've just had one in the UK on whether to change our electoral system from first past the post to proportional representation.
And that was binding.
And that would have been a binding referendum if it had been won. It was lost, actually. But if it had been won, we would have shifted to proportional representation, or to alternative vote, actually.
And you don't feel that that's shifting the landscape of political authority?
No, I don't think so, really, because I think it's in a very limited sphere.
So in the United States, we have this theory of popular sovereignty, and it actually justifies the role of the very special, for 100 years, the very special role of our federal judiciary, which is our judiciary has the power of judicial review. It can strike down as unconstitutional, otherwise valid actions by Congress or by the executive, and we give this power to the courts because we say they're interpreting the Constitution, which is the voice of the people, which is a higher authority than the voice of the representatives of the people in Congress or in the president's office. Now, you never had a tradition of this in the UK. Your judges would never tamper with parliamentary legislation, but you were actually responsible for a fundamental shift in that landscape in the human rights legislation, which you enacted in 1998. And under that legislation, UK judges now interpret UK legislation in order to make it consistent with the European Convention of Human Rights. And they can issue declarations of incompatibility. They can't strike it down, but they can fast-track it in Parliament. And this is a very fundamental change in the way judges imagine their role and their job in the UK.
And why? I thought about this very deeply, actually, more so than people sometimes think, because they sort of looked upon it as a sort of line in a manifesto that we just implemented. And I think it's a very interesting reflection about society and about politics. I mean, first of all, there was an immediate practical stimulus for this change in our system because we were members of the European Convention on Human Rights, so you could go to the European Court on Human Rights, you just couldn't pursue the case in your own courts on the basis of human rights. So there was a logic, in a sense, of saying, look, you should better take the case in our courts rather than having to go to the European Court of Human Rights. So there was that sort of practical stimulus for this change. But there was another stimulus that I actually thought was more profound, and that was that I think it, as part of the checks and balances of your system, I think it is important to be prepared to say that, looked at from the aspect of human rights, there is a limit to what Parliament can do, and there are limits to the majority will. And I believe that to be true in the sense that I think there are fundamental inalienable rights that people have. And I also think the courts are probably the best place to deliberate it. Now, when I was younger, by the way, just out of law school, I wrote a pamphlet strongly criticizing this concept of putting they never found it, actually, when I was doing the legislation, otherwise it would have been embarrassing. But, and, you know, because what I used to say was, and actually I used to reference a lot of the decisions in the US and say, look, let's be clear about this. These judges are sitting here talking about politics. And it's what they actually think about politics is going to determine what view they have. Because these are intensely political issues. You know, you think of your major constitutional questions. These are intensely political questions. And that was what I felt then. And what I felt later was, well, yes, it's true that, of course, and you know, it's impossible for any person to put small p politics out of their system, especially if they're looking at highly controversial political questions. But I came to the conclusion in the end that it was a more healthy forum in which to have that debate.
Why?
Because I think for us, certainly in our system, I hope for you too, in a way, although I know obviously the political appointment system makes certain differences, but I actually think there is an independence that is important there in making that decision. And I always remember that, because, by the way, having passed the human rights legislation, the courts used to be striking me down the whole time. So I used to get people in my office come into me and say, I told you that was a bad idea. And I used to say to them, you know, sometimes I remember when they struck down something on terrorism, which mattered enormously to me. This was a really important, we toughened up the laws and certain aspects to detain people that we thought were a real threat to the country, but we didn't have enough evidence to prosecute and so on. The court struck it down. And I always remember one of my advisors coming to my office and saying, you know, these judges is just, you know, who the hell do they think they are, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, you must never say that. Because in the end, these are the people that will ultimately defend your freedom. Right? Now, they may take a different view of this case than I've taken, and I'm very irritated that they've taken that view. But I will defend completely their right to do it. And I think it's a healthy part of a democratic system that there is this independent judiciary that is capable of doing this. And I came to the conclusion, I haven't altered it, that the independence and integrity of our bar and our legal system is a really, really important bulwark of our liberty.
So do I hear in what you're saying now an echo of where you started about the House of Lords? I mean, one issue is the independence of the judiciary, but another might be their expertise in questions of human. I mean, is that what you want to cabin majority will with, the kind of expertise?
Yeah, no, and I think, I don't know whether your politics is the same as ours in this, but short-term politics now is very rough and sometimes feral, and sometimes, or maybe it's a little bit, yeah. And sometimes it's at the expense of long-term policy, right? So I think it's all the more important that you do have some, maybe checks and balances is even the wrong way to do it, but you should enlarge the nature of the debate in some way. And, you know, I think one of the interesting things about democracy, because although, you know, I'm very clear what it is about, and we were I was talking earlier about this democracy in the sense of this attitude of mind, although I'm very clear about that. I also think there is a case for examining whether our systems of democracy don't need to be themselves modernized to take account of the different way that politics works today. You know? So, because, I mean, I was just giving one example, which is to do with this gene pool going into politics. I mean, at a certain point, that's going to become really difficult for us. And then when you multiply it with this very short-term nature of politics, you know, constant, you know, like our parliamentary system, we used to cover parliamentary debates, and there were real debates, and people made real speeches. And, you know, if you go back in the days when Churchill and F.E. Smith and Lloyd George and these people were speaking in the House of Commons, the debates would be covered by the newspapers in Parliament, right? This would be a major event. If each maiden speech, even when I first began, came in 1983, my maiden speech was covered in the Times. I was so proud. I got one paragraph, but I was very proud of it. Today, that doesn't happen. The guys just go out and put out a press release. You know, because actually it's all about interacting with the media, not interacting in a debate. Okay. You see Prime Minister's questions, but otherwise the thing's quite empty. So
how would you modernize politics? What would you do?
Well, I think you need to examine how you create an ability for, as I say, different types of people to come into politics. I think the whole question of funding of politics is very tricky. Again, probably both sides of the water. I think this issue, certainly, as I say, this is what informs my view of, say, changing the House of Lords, more an independent judiciary. And I think the political parties need to look at how they structure themselves nowadays so that you don't end up, as I say, with this slightly bizarre situation where the parties become more partisan as people become more open.
So if we think about expertise as cabining the deformities of a certain kind of short-term politics, you run into the question of what happens when the expertise and the political will collide. I mean, that happened with you over issues of terrorism, where I think you were referring earlier to the Belmarsh case, where the House of Lords declared as incompatible with the European Convention indefinite detention of non-British citizens who were accused of terrorism. And as I remember at the time, you were quite irritated, and you said, we have to have a politics which puts priority on the attainment of social order and social peace, and people have to feel secure, you said. And here you have these judges who, you know, they may know European Convention law, but they don't know from what people need actually is security.
Yep.
You were quite overt about that.
Yeah, and so in the end, who predominates in that situation? And my view is that you know, we're still right to have the system in which they've got that ability to say, no, I understand your argument that this curtailment of liberty is necessary in the interests of security, but we have examined this and tested this and don't agree. So I, in the end, was prepared to agree that they should have the right to disagree and to enforce, even though, obviously, I felt, you know, and indeed after the Belmarsh verdict, we had 7/7, our own terrorist incident. So, you know, but it's a really difficult argument, this, and it can go back and forth, and there's a lot of merit on both sides of it. I mean, one of the things I think is really unfortunate about political debate today is you've always got to, you know, people who disagree with you have somehow got to be wicked. I mean, people who disagree with you usually just disagree with you. You know, you should respect their motives even if you disagree. And I think this issue to do with security and liberty is fantastically difficult. I mean, you've got it over Guantanamo and all these issues here. It's fantastically difficult. So the question is, since there will be a disagreement, what's the framework within which you resolve things? And as I say, I came to the conclusion in the end that this constitutional settlement was the right one.
You did. I mean, in fact, you enforced the judgment of the House of Lords, which was, under the circumstances, quite remarkable. But then along came this incident in the subway bombing, and it sort of changed, I thought, the game in the UK. And I think, in fact, at that time you gave a press conference, and you kind of, I don't know, exactly how you put this. You put a shot across the bow of the House of Lords, is the way I would put it. In the press conference, you suggested that if the law lords were to attempt to strike down the new anti-terror legislation, there would be an issue. You said, should legal obstacles arise, we will legislate further, including, if necessary, amending the Human Rights Act in respect of the interpretation of the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, in the United States, we would understand that on a separation of powers model. You have checks, you have balances, which means each side signals the other where are really limits that matter to it.
Yeah, and here was the problem as a politician, because I had brought in the Human Rights Act, and I supported it. But of course, a lot of the newspapers, particularly on the right of the politics, were saying, you can't provide us with security because of this act you've introduced, so what are you going to do about it? So we had to maneuver a little way on that one. But it was, it also, I think, what then happens, frankly, is that and this is where, although you do have the independent judiciary, they're still part of the general public discourse. And so there's a certain sensitivity that comes. I mean, would they have decided Belmarsh in quite the same way a week earlier? We just had, so I don't know. But I mean, it's, so, you know, I mean, there's got to be a certain amount of, none of these systems are perfect. They have their imperfections and they have their inconsistencies. And even in our case, some eccentricities. But I think in the end, as I say, I thought that was the right way to do it.
So one of the, I would say, the deepest constitutional changes that's overtaking Great Britain now has to do with its relationship with the EU. And of course, everyone on this side of the Atlantic is worrying about the monetary union, of which the UK is not a member, but will surely affect things in the UK. And wondering what advice you have to give on how we should be handling this problem with the euro crisis.
Ooh, right. Well, essentially, I think in the next few weeks in Europe, we've got to decide whether we're fully and wholly committed to the single currency or not. And if we are, that means putting the full weight of the creditor nations and the ECB behind it. And then I think you've got to have a long-term framework of reform and change that's around fiscal coordination coming alongside monetary union and reform of the European social model. But what is really happening in monetary union is that the fact is it was really motivated by political idealism, but it's an economic union, and that's the design flaw. So what should have happened is that when people went into this economic union, the politics and the economics caught up with the politics. It's not what's happened, and now it's going to happen at a very fast rate, but it's immensely difficult, and the options are all ugly, I'm afraid. So it's very tough right now. Now, in the long term, by the way, I am convinced that European integration will continue. But you know, my view about Europe is that today the rationale for Europe is not the rationale of 60 years ago. The rationale of 60 years ago is peace. It was how to bring peace to this continent that had been a perpetual war for centuries and then gone through two appalling, terrible world wars in which there was devastating loss of human life and the Holocaust and so on. The rationale for Europe today is not peace, it's power. The truth is, in the world that's developing, you know, every European country, even Germany, even Italy, France, Britain, the big European countries in terms of population, we're small in terms of the way the world's moving. You've got China, you've got India. You take a country like Indonesia, and you know a lot about it in a moment, but it's 240 million people. It's 3 times the population size of Germany. As GDP realigns with population, which is the other thing that's happening in the world, then, you know, for Europe, if it wants to count, it's got to collectively, you know, combine its collective weight to advance its individual interests. So the actual project of European integration, I think, will continue. But monetary unions, to continue, has got to take these very fundamental and extraordinarily difficult decisions in fast time.
So from the perspective of the United States, it looks like the politics has to catch up with the economics, that there's an economic, that European countries in the Union, in the monetary union, are in a common economic basket, but they don't have the political equipment yet to know that, to lead and take the steps that have to be taken in order to make that union viable. So it's the political system that seems to have to catch up with the economic.
Yeah, except that in the sense that in a way the political decisions that need to be taken are the economic ones.
Yeah.
So, but you need the will to do that.
Right.
And the issue is whether, I mean, if you're the German Chancellor right now, it's a very, very hard decision to take. But, you know, there was an article in the Financial Times that I thought got it very well a couple of months ago, describing this sort of concept of trying to postpone the day of the decision. And it told the story of the king who sentenced the man to death. And then he said to the man he sentenced to death, look, I'll postpone the sentence for a year if you can teach my horse to talk. And the guy says, okay, I'll take that deal. And people said to him, what do you mean? How can you take that deal? He said, look, in the next year, anything can happen. He said, the king could die, I could die, or the horse could talk. And I'm afraid we're now at the stage in Europe where the horse isn't going to talk. So we've got to take that decision now.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're predicting that in the long run, despite the weaknesses that we see in European integration that this crisis exposes, in the long run, the UK has to become even more involved.
Yeah, look, the thing with the UK is, it's, you know, this is my passion for trying to, in a way, modernize the country and get it over what I think are basic, you know, 20th century politics about left and right. It's not the issue for a country like the UK today. UK began the 20th century as the most powerful country in the world, and it didn't end it that way. You guys have sort of leapt ahead by then. And that's the way it is. So we're a country with an enormously proud history, but you can't live in your past. You've got to be proud of your past. You don't live in it. The world's changing the whole time and evolving. And for us, it's absolutely simple. We've got two big alliances. We're a close, if not the closest, ally of the United States, which is the world's biggest power right now. And we're part of the largest commercial market and political union in the world, which is the European Union. So use both of them. I can never understand this. You know, you were talking about this. People used to say you've got to choose between the two. And it's absurd. Why on earth would you? You've got two great assets, so you leverage their ability to help you. And for a country like Britain today, you know, we could actually help Europe as well. I mean, Europe, what has Europe got to do? It's got to get its economy back on track, of course, but then it's got to have a common defense policy that isn't about getting rid of individual armies. But if we're going to partner you guys or do things even on our own, right, we're going to have the capacity to do it, right? So we're going to have to get it, a common energy policy. I mean, how ridiculous is it to have in a country the size, or a part of the world the size of Europe, to have all these different grids and so on, and you know, there's so much you could do to develop a common energy policy. Problems like organized crime, illegal immigration, you can't deal with them on an individual country basis. So there's huge rationale for Europe that's about power, and in particular in a world in which China is going to be dominant. Europe needs to be strong and big.
So on that evidence of an open mind and being able to face the future with courage and vision, please join me in thanking Prime Minister Tony Blair. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.